Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. This is the podcast produced for Strategy International, a global think tank and consulting firm that brings together great minds from all over the world to collaborate and discuss on issues of global interest, such as international policy, defense, security, the economy, the environment, and much, much more. Of course, you can always head on to www.strategyinternational.org to see all the wonderful things being done over there, as well as the entire back catalog of all these wonderful productions. Speaking of great minds, we have an incredible guest today on the podcast, Brian Wong. He's an assistant professor in philosophy at the Hong Kong University. He is a political theorist and a geopolitical strategist. His research examines authoritarian regimes and citizens' political and moral responsibilities, colonial and historical injustices, and the interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy of states in East Asia and especially in China. We're going to have a great discussion today. Brian, thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Well, thanks for having me, George. It's my pleasure.
I'm excited to talk to you because we haven't yet addressed that region in our previous podcast. And of course, as anyone knows and anyone who follows understands that there's a lot going on in that region, especially with respect to China, its influence in a greater region. And we're going to have a great discussion today.
I'm very excited about the discussion.
Well, first and foremost, let me just start because, and I want to go back a little bit to the conflict that is currently underway or ongoing in East Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And almost immediately, as soon as that conflict started, everyone started looking at China, and people thought, that's very strange. There's a conflict happening in Europe. For the first time in decades, they were considering this as an invasion of Europe again. And all strategists and analysts were looking at what's happening in China. They were thinking that perhaps China would replicate that attack onto Taiwan. Nothing's happened yet, although the relationship between the two countries seem to be quite fragile. Give us very quickly, just like an overview before we get to talk about more specifically in the region, about what's happening in that area and the relationship, how fragile it is.
Sure. I think it's worth noting, George, when thinking about Beijing's approach to cross-strait relations, that from the point of view of the Chinese government in Beijing, they see Taiwan as a part of their territories. I mean, it's a part of the CPC's claim to legitimacy, claim to rule, and also ultimately the accomplishment and achievement of what they term national reunification is integral to their political legacy building. And by there, I mean the leadership, but also the party by and large. So when thinking about cross-strait relations, we've got to understand the overarching matrix, which is that the leading party in a country of 1.4 billion people sees its own territorial intactness and also national unity as being of paramount importance, not just for security or economic reasons. So I'm hearing a lot of these hot takes about the fact that Beijing wants Taiwan for the chips, Beijing wants Taiwan for the money. It's none of that, really. It's a symbolic normative play that matters very clearly to the incumbent party leadership, and also, I would add, many of the preceding generations of leaders within the Communist Party of China. Now, as for Taiwan, of course, this is a fantastic island on which I have many friends. I have many friends with whom I've stayed at Oxford, spent a lot of time in the UK, and I genuinely think it is a very entrepreneurial and also creative people, and arguably one of the most progressive and also forward-thinking peoples in East Asia when it comes to advanced technologies, when it comes to social and also civil liberties. Really, everyone, cities, regions, countries, all around Asia and beyond, we should look towards Taiwan to really see an exemplar of what a healthy blending of Western liberal progressive principles are, or at least I support them and I see them as important, but also with a Confucian cultural undertone and backbone to it, which brings me on to my answer to your question today, that obviously cross-straits tensions and also the standstill and at large the antagonism that we see from both sides of the straits is unfortunate and is deeply, deeply jarring, especially when coupled with threats of potential military escalation, whether it be because of great power rivalry and interplay between Beijing and Washington, or more locally speaking, the possibility of an accidental conflict, which I've been warning about over the past couple of years. I'm genuinely more concerned about an accidental conflict or skirmish leading to an unbridled war than any sort of premeditated move on the island by Beijing or Washington or Taipei itself. And
Mm-hmm.
that's to say that because of the antagonism that exists, the question is, how can we find a proposal that can maximize the interests and also secure the well-being of everyone, all parties involved, especially those on two sides of the straits? And it is, in my humble opinion, that the efforts by both Beijing and Washington over the past 18 months in setting up guardrails, in signaling very clearly, and as has been affirmed by the outgoing leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, that ultimately the status quo is the way to go. It is the least bad out of all the possible options for all parties involved, preserving a peaceful status quo, no war, no military escalation, and will let the organic forces of interaction between the two sides of the straits take their course, alongside, of course, the room for skepticism and cynicism, which certainly exists, right? So at the moment, it's almost like a tug of war. On one hand, you see economic integration and more synergy, a lot of Taiwanese folks traveling to the mainland to set up their own businesses. In fact, if you go to Kunshan, which is this city in Jiangsu that I was in just recently, it's filled with Taiwanese business persons, trying to set up their own businesses, their SMEs, so on and so forth. And whilst mainland investors and also tourists to Taiwan have decreased over recent years due to political friction and also heightened animosity, by and large, the resumption of people-to-people ties and exchanges in the early days of President Xi's, and also in the early days of Ma Ying-jeou, the leader of Taiwan's interactions with President Xi, and a resumption of cultural and educational exchanges that took place after that, has been by and large conducive towards fostering a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the picture across both sides of the strait. So where do we stand? We stand at a present status quo where, frankly, there are indeed seeds for tensions. There's room for rapid escalation, and there's a lot of unthinkable and undesirable scenarios that play out, which would thwart the interests of the many folks who have a skin in the game, the millions, the hundreds of millions of folks who care about what happens over this channel. And yet, at the same time, it's not all doom and gloom. I see upsides. I see positive trajectories in terms of a more peaceful and also fruitful bidirectional exchange and conversation taking place across the straits. But the key here, of course, is that the mainland needs to understand, and America needs to understand, that Taiwan is neither a monolith nor an instrument. Taiwan is a people with agency. Taiwan is you've got 20 odd million folks. These are all people with their own dreams, own aspirations and skill sets. We cannot erase their voices. We cannot turn their own island of residence, their own identity, into essentially a battering ram, into a tool of bargaining and bartering in great power politics. That, to me, is a key baseline and also really the key upside, or rather the takeaway that I have from the ongoing tensions over the straits. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very well, actually. I just want to circle back to what you were saying about, peaceful and status quo. It seems as though those two words don't match in the same sentence, especially as of lately. But I also want to highlight that you have a more hopeful approach to this conflict. So I'm just wondering, how can we include in that same sentence peaceful status quo, given the current context? And is there a window where this hopeful approach that you seem to aspire to is even possible?
Yeah, so I would just point to the fact that at present, what we are seeing is increasing militarization over the Indo-Pacific by US-led order. You might say liberal international order. You might say US and allies, and that has manifested through the form of AUKUS with regards to Australia and the UK, the Quad, of course, Japan, Australia and India, and increasingly there's talk of a US-Philippines alignment. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, we're seeing more, proactive and also visceral mainland Chinese military and also other forms of incursions. And some have even alleged, right, that they are attempts to, move in or to influence politics within Taiwan. Although, again, the evidence on the latter is relatively limited as compared with the explicit evidence for the former, that there has indeed been more pressure and a ratcheting up of pressure, especially in relation to recent elections and also domestic political developments within Taiwan. So it's certainly the case that we're seeing an escalation, don't get me wrong. But does that therefore mean that the status quo is not peaceful? I mean, firstly, it's worth noting that what we're not seeing in Taiwan and over the Straits is the kind of devastation and atrocities that we're seeing in Ukraine, and also the tragedy, the tragic events unfolding in Gaza right now as we speak, or indeed a Yemeni civil war, or all of these active kinetic military conflicts. It's not to say that there isn't a possibility for kinetic war over Taiwan, which I've already established just then would be disastrous, would be dreadful, would be truly devastating, not just for the region, but for the entirety of the world. But at the moment, we're not seeing a movement towards war. We're seeing militarization in rhetoric, militarization in investment, and of course, there is the inevitable rise in probabilities of an accidental skirmish and conflict. But does that therefore mean that we're moving actively towards war? I've got to be honest here, I don't think so, right? And that's largely because of incentives on all three sides, okay, of the equation, the mainland, Taiwan, and also the USA. So let's start with Taiwan. William Lai, right? A lot of folks, commentators, especially, individuals who are usually quite sympathetic towards Taiwan, and yet they obviously have a certain, I say, jaundiced view of the new DPP leadership. They tend to say Willie Lai is unpredictable, is capricious, is mercurial. But in all honesty, yes, Willie Lai may harbor some pretty incendiary and extreme thoughts in private, but he's a very savvy politician, and he's well aware that it's not in anyone's interest to push the envelope too far when it comes to Taiwan. He's ultimately there to govern, and he will indeed govern. And there's no reason to think he won't want to or want to cede his ability to govern the island. So I do not think there's any motivation on his part to push the envelope of either Washington, which has adopted this dual deterrence approach under President Biden, or alternatively Beijing, which obviously views Taiwan's actions as a very important part of its own national and domestic political strategy. So on that front, I don't think Taiwan is going to be the primary trigger. And then you might say, well, what about Beijing, right? And here's the thing, right? At the moment, the mainland Chinese government is doubling down on economic recovery. It's trying to re-engage the world, emphasis being on trying to re-engage the world when it comes to global supply chains, on trade, on bolstering domestic consumption, on strengthening the transition and also pivot away from unproductive investments, and finally tackling youth unemployment issues. All of these are malaise that are serious. They are very, very serious burdens that the incumbent administration needs to tackle, needs to fix and reform. I do not see going to war as adding to this or contributing towards resolution in any meaningful sense of the word. And even if the argument is, oh, well, they might pursue diversionary and distractionary war, isn't that, we often hear the assertion, right? A diversionary war might happen. But I say, can you point me to an example where a government that's seeking to address serious economic concerns, not necessarily unfixable, but serious concerns, and has the ability and resources to do so, and is generally on an upward trajectory? Is there an example of a government that would basically undertake a self-immolating, self-destructive move by moving in on another territory or plot of land or island or country or region? I don't think so, right? And therefore, the incentive for the mainland to move on Taiwan over the next 10 years in a military sense is very low. And furthermore, I do believe, and this is only from my assessment of open source information, the articles I read, the commentaries I read coming out of the mainland, that Beijing genuinely sees alternatives such as economic integration, more trade, more dialogue as a viable strategy still. That even though past attempts to court Taiwan haven't necessarily worked as well as intended, they're not going to give up on these strategies simply because they're far less costly than a military intervention. And that brings me on to the final point, which is the USA. Some folks, especially very nationalistic commentators in the mainland, would say, oh, the US is going to go China into a war. That's their claim, so to speak. And at the very least, though, when I look at Biden, at the very least, I look at Biden and his team, you've got Kurt Campbell, you've got Jake Sullivan, you've got Blinken. All of these, all of these folks, even if they may not necessarily understand China and Chinese politics to the max, these are sturdy, these are steady pairs of hands who have been in the foreign policy circles or in the political circles for decades, at least a decade, if not more. They understand fully well the potential repercussions and deleterious consequences that would arise from a Sino-American showdown over the Taiwan Straits. I don't think the Democratic administration or the team in the White House right now, or in Foggy Bottom, or you name it, in a relevant bureau in charge in America today, is keen at all on starting a military conflict with China, which, let's not forget, remains a key trade partner, economic partner, and also in many ways deeply intertwined with the US that the USSR had never been in the past. So having gone through all three of these, candidates, of course, you might say, well, what about Donald Trump? And that is perhaps a question I can answer, in a subsequent discussion. But for now, I do not see the military escalation in rhetoric and also seeming intensity as connoting and also portending warfare. At the very most, it's a sign that we should get and set up a more comprehensive multilateral framework for managing, cross-strait relations and de-escalating. But I don't see at all cause for serious concern, save from, of course, the inevitable rise in the chance and risk of an accidental conflict that Stephen Roach actually wrote about in his excellent book that came out, I believe, earlier last year, in Q1 last year.
I want to go back, because what you said was very interesting. The fact that there's so many other pressing issues that have to be dealt with. Unemployment and economic policies and so on. And I don't disagree with you. I think obviously there's a priority list that comes probably way before any sort of thought on military action, and that kind of got me thinking about Taiwan's relations with other countries in the region that seem to be under China's pressure and influence for international isolation. Is that happening? There's a lot of analysts that have written on that possibility about China influencing the region to kind of isolate Taiwan. So going back to the point that you were making, in light of the policies and the governance that Taiwan needs to be thinking about right now, that would be an additional stress to know that the regional partners seem to be pressured by China to kind of isolate Taiwan.
Could you give a couple of examples on that front? The specific examples of instances of pressure by Beijing to isolate Taiwan?
I don't know, but there are a lot of analysts that have been suggesting the regional influence that China has had pertaining to the relations with Taiwan. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. It's worth noting that Taiwan currently has, I believe, formal diplomatic relations with around 10 or 11? 11, yes. 11 out of all the UN member states. And therefore, for a vast majority of its engagement and what it terms external relations or non-state-based official relations with foreign entities, which, by the way, I believe is really testament to the craftiness and entrepreneurial spirit on a part of Taiwanese politicians. I mean, Taiwan has by and large maintained relations that across DPP and KMT governments, they have openly declared to be non-state based, which is why the American representatives in Taiwan are not labeled the American embassy, because Taiwan is not, in accordance with the US, right? It is not an independent state. And therefore you have the American institutes there, or the AIT, so to speak, but not an American embassy. And the same could be said of Taiwan's relations with Japan, Taiwan's relations with many of the other neighboring states in the Indo-Pacific region, which haven't really been altered or changed over recent years, right? There's talk of more pressure being applied on these states to isolate Taiwan. I mean, you mentioned that, but what I fail to see there is the delta, as in the quantum of actual changes within Indo-Pacific when it comes to countries that are or used to recognize Taiwan and now no longer recognize Taiwan, or no longer used to not recognize Taiwan and now recognize Taiwan. I mean, that to me, to attribute changes in numbers on that front to what Beijing has done or is doing, strikes me as a plausible empirical thesis. Just needs way more testing and verification, though. But going back to the really underlying core and the gist of your question, right, which is, are there efforts to sever ties between Taiwan and the rest of the international community in a non-state-based fashion? Sure. And that's been a consistent part of the CPC's approach to Taiwan, which is a combination of economic integration and synthesis, a so-called carrot on one hand, and on the other hand, putting pressure on states and governments that Beijing views as drifting too close to Taiwan or recognizing what Taiwan claims to be, its own political status. And that's also when Beijing will step in, and it has done so consistently since the 1980s all the way through to now. So I don't see a delta or an increase or decrease on that front either. But of course, the elephant in the room is in terms of how the international community perceives this issue. 40 years back, 50 years back. Let's roll back the clock, right? 50 years ago, China, mainland China was in 1974. So that was the final 2 years of the Cultural Revolution. The mainland Chinese economy was tiny. It was in shambles. It was deeply, deeply closed off from the world. And sure, whilst Mao Zedong tried to engage, the third world, he had a very brilliant idea of the three worlds theory and strategies on that front. But ultimately, mainland China back then was not an economic tour de force. It lacked the versatility, the resilience, and the potential for growth of Taiwan. And that was why 50 years back, there was still talk of, basically a lot of delicate dancing around the issue of who the rightful claim and heir to the Chinese seat in the UN is. And of course, it became in itself a very contentious issue, which was eventually resolved, right? Or rather, it was resolved in the early 1970s when there was a recognition of the PRC as a sole legal representative of China. But even then, the economic disparity between Taiwan and the mainland was pretty clear, and it was tilted in favor of Taiwan. But 50 years on, China's now, at very least, mainland China, the world's second largest economy. That's in nominal terms. And in PPP, which we may or may not believe in or subscribe to, because there's a lot of fuzziness and fudgedness about the data and the stats there. In terms of PPP, some say it's the largest economy in the world. Whereas Taiwan, as impressive as its semiconductor industry has been, and all of these fantastic developments that we've seen take place over the past few decades, it is dwarfed in size by the mainland. So what this therefore means is that when it comes to the calculus and the incentives of a vast majority of countries around the world and UN member states who don't necessarily have the kind of geopolitical agenda or geopolitical interests and stakes either way, whether it be pro-Beijing or anti-Beijing, for them, it's just a matter of money. It's a matter of economic engagement. It's a matter of, which of these two do they want to do more business and trade with? And that is, it is what it is. It is a state of geopolitical reality. It is a fact of geopolitical pragmatism that we've seen the evolution and development over the past few decades to the current point and state of affairs. And obviously, it is my wish that as analysts and commentators in general, we have to do two things. The first is to focus on the facts. And secondly, to divide or to really split up what we think is the case from what we believe should be the case. Right. And that's why I'm only going to stick to the facts. And I hope, you also appreciate that that's what I tend to do best, right? I stick to what's going on. I stick to the numbers. I stick to the facts, and I tell it as it is. And that's my take on the current situation.
I want to move on to the relations, the regional relations with the U.S.
Yeah.
But before we do, though, I want to circle back to that more hopeful approach you had about the region. What are some prospects for increased regional cooperation, either in technology or innovation, or probably maybe even in artificial intelligence or advanced manufacturing in the region? I just want to get to something more hopeful.
Can I just clarify which region are you talking about? Is it cross-strait? Is it ASEAN, RCEP?
We're gonna get to ASEAN for a second, but just specifically with respect to China and the influence it has in that region.
Right. So just to be clear, you mean China's influence over Southeast Asia or Chinese influence over East Asia, or which part? So yeah,
let's go Southeast Asia because I want to jump on to ASEAN after. Yeah.
For sure. So look, here's my assessment of what China's relationship with ASEAN is. And frankly, I see both upsides, and room for hope and also room for pessimism and also concern. So I'm going to go through three key main points in my brief summary. The first is on economics. The second is on technology. And the third concerns, the elephant in the room, which frankly, if Sino-ASEAN cooperation is to manifest and play out properly, there needs to be some kind of stopgap or more permanent modus vivendi in relation to this elephant in the room, which is the South China Sea. So let's start with the economics. ASEAN and China are, as of today, I believe, the largest trading partners of one another. Chinese FDI in ASEAN has been a primary engine and source of growth. And really, ASEAN firms view China as a gigantic market, but also manufacturing complement, a manufacturing partner in the sense that ASEAN specializes as a region, and Southeast Asian countries by and large specialize in more, labor intensive and therefore wage cost dependent, manufacturing, was given that China, frankly, is seeking to move up the value chain and is no longer positioning itself as a mid-income country, China is very much trying to own the advanced manufacturing space. And therefore, there's a degree of complementarity between Southeast Asia and China. Although, as I've said in my previous op-eds, as countries like Malaysia and Indonesia turn to manufacturing their own EVs, they want to, establish their own EVs and also solar panel factories and also own a share of the market and a pie, so to speak. That is inevitably where the interests may well come into collision with China if Beijing doesn't know how to manage its trade and economic relations delicately. We've seen what happened with Brazil with regards to the recent probe into Chinese EVs. European Union, it goes without saying, of course, on automobiles, there are clear divides, as evidenced by the testy remarks that Scholz issued even after his rather conciliatory and amicable visit to Beijing, which is to say that whilst there is more economic integration and financially speaking, it makes perfect sense, right, for Chinese capital that can go abroad and overseas, especially state-backed capital, to invest into Southeast Asia in exchange for perhaps more labor and migration from Southeast Asia. All of these are theoretically possible upsides, yet in practice, we must not forget that sooner rather than later, ASEAN, as an independent, autonomous region with disparate interests and disparate preferences amongst its member states, will want to compete with China on certain dimensions, on certain axes. Can Beijing manage these differences and also reassure ASEAN countries that there's more to be gained from win-win cooperation as opposed to just one person wins or the other country wins at the expense of others? That is a test of Chinese diplomacy and behoves Chinese diplomats to exhibit not just an awareness and appreciation of ASEAN perspectives, but also the needs and interests of these Southeast Asian people, of which there are around 60 million, with an average median age of around 32.8. And that's a very, very young population, also a large population as well, as compared with China's aging population as we speak. So that's the economic side. I want to now talk about technology. So obviously, on the front of technology, there's a lot of what I call micro causes and micro factors that point to convergence of interests. Firstly, the vast data set and the volume of data in ASEAN and also in China means that in a case of data sharing arrangements or having innovation and technology that straddles both Southeast Asia and China, drawing upon basically data that you can see and you can gain from approximately 1/4, if not slightly over that, of the world's population, that's immense. That grants any and all digital startup who wants to set up shop in Jakarta, run a business or the sort of subdivision and franchise in China. It's basically a dream for startup entrepreneurs and innovators who want to leverage upon data connectivity and technological synergy in order to build up their own SMEs from scratch and their own startups from scratch. That is an area that's often neglected in status quo discussions because people don't think of things that way. They don't see data as a common resource. They see it instead as a source of competition and tension, right? But it's worth noting that. And furthermore, on the fronts of renewables, nano and biotechnology and health technology, and finally, of course, what China's been emphasizing all along, batteries, so to speak, batteries for EVs, batteries for renewable energy, batteries for chargers. These are all dimensions where, if China is able to demonstrate it's sincere about technology and knowledge sharing, I firmly believe Southeast Asian countries would be incredibly welcoming to the presence of Chinese firms and also knowledge repositories in them. I just came back from Vietnam, where frankly I was super impressed by the variety of firms and variety of manufacturers from Germany, Vietnam, from Kazakhstan, from Thailand, from Japan and China and the US who've set up shop in Vietnam. It's clear that Southeast Asian countries don't want to take sides and want to broadly engage the world, engage disparate parties, India, China, you name it, as a means of advancing their own industrial development. So if China is able to show to Southeast Asia that it's not going into them just to invest in factories that hire only Chinese staff and that engage in zero knowledge dissemination, if that's something that China is willing to pivot away from, or perhaps be more mindful of in terms of refraining from, then I'm sure Sino-ASEAN technological cooperation could indeed be moving in a smoother and also more positive direction overall. But with one significant caveat, as we saw recently with the request issued by the American side to UAE that A42, the requirement that G42, not A42, G42 ceases any and all collaboration with Chinese partners in exchange for continued investment from leading American private tech companies. I mean, this is a pretty clear signal that even in the spaces of tech, beyond economics, beyond military, beyond strategy, but even in tech, right, neutrality between China and the US could well be increasingly difficult and unlikely. And that's largely because of pressures from both Beijing and Washington, and might I say perhaps more from Washington at this point, for countries to take sides, right? And it's understandable that Washington, wants to set up this, what they call a small yard high fence, although increasingly I'm convinced it's a sort of medium-sized yard and a very tall fence with encroachment and also overgrowth expanding in all sorts of directions. We just heard talk about checking, or rather looking into and probing into Chinese medical technology and also medtech firms, right? I believe that piece of news came out this morning, and we're likely to see more restrictive measures being pursued by Secretary Raimondo going forward into the election year. But the gist here is, as long as it's possible, I'm fairly certain that Southeast Asian countries don't want to choose between China and the US when it comes to technological, data, and digital partnerships either, right? So that's the second prong on the front of Sino-ASEAN relations. And that ties me on to the final point, which is the elephant in the room. Everything I've said thus far points to seemingly a cautiously and yet fundamentally positive, uptick and also improvement in Sino-Southeast Asian relations. And yet, of course, the concern that many of my friends in Southeast Asia often say to me is a concern about what might happen over the South China Sea, which is a historically entrenched, technically intricate, legally opaque, and frankly, politically and geopolitically hotly contested issue.
Yeah.
This is, again, another flashpoint. And as I've written previously in numerous op-eds, I'm more concerned about South China Sea and an accidental skirmish there than potential conflict over the Taiwan Straits. And that's because in the latter case, there's actually fairly substantive guard railing and also installation of what we call, risk mitigation and management mechanisms from all sides in that equation to potentially, even in the event of potential flare-ups, contain the flare-ups. Whereas in the case of South China Seas, there are many more parties involved. I don't buy into a narrative that's just China versus US. That's too reductionist.
Right.
Where's the agency? Well, why are we ignoring the agency of Indonesia? Why are we ignoring Malaysia or Singapore or Brunei or Vietnam? Why? Or the Philippines, of course, right? Why are we writing them off? That to me is unfair. But more importantly, I'm also concerned about it because, frankly, the stakes and the skin in the game are equally as high for all parties involved as they are for China. And that's to say, it's not just about fishing rights or safety of passage or the ability to access the resources, in the Nansha Islands or in the south, so to speak, and the different names for the Nansha Islands. Of course, the Spratly Islands are the name that I often hear from my Southeast Asian friends. But it's also about the military and defensive security implications, right, of that region. And that's something that if China wants to advance really sincerely its relations, its multilateral relations with Southeast Asia, it needs to accept that on this region, everyone, and all, must be a part of a movement, part of a dialogical process that leads us hopefully eventually to peaceful resolution, which I believe can be done, which I firmly believe can be done, but it requires diplomatic acumen and tact on the part of all parties, not just China, but also the Philippines, Vietnam, and all these other stakeholders in the region, in order for tensions there to be managed and contained effectively. So I'll stop there, realizing when it comes to Southeast Asia, I get very animated.
No, it's great. It's great, and you did mention something, and it opens the door to the next conversation. So I'll jump right in there about the influence that the U.S. may have in that region, Asian, and those growing. I don't know if they're still called that, but when I was studying back in the day, we used to call those the tiger economies. I suspect they're still described as such, but. you know, there's so many initiatives that have been spearheaded by the U.S. in the region, whether it's AUKUS that you mentioned before, or whether it's the Indo-Pacific agreement.
Yeah.
How do you see that, and do you believe that it's an attempt from the West, specifically the U.S., to gain more influence in that region to kind of seclude China out of the equation? What is your take on that?
That's a great question, and I always say this, and it's funny because I crack this as a joke almost. That in many of my talks, I often say, "What is China, and what is America?" I ask the audience, and the audience would look at me like I'm mad. They say, "China is China, and America is America, the countries." Okay, and I say, "Right, but when you say China thinks like this, or you say America thinks like that." Let's take America as an example, right? And I hear these narratives that are often broadcast on my Twitter feed and also some other, on my LinkedIn feed sometimes. And people say America is a paranoid, schizophrenic country, blah, 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 and so forth. And I would always be tempted to ask them, who do you mean? What do you mean? Like the Silicon Valley startup tech entrepreneur is a paranoid maniac when it comes to China, or that the guy who's running his little farm in Ohio, he doesn't, he wants to be embroiled in a Thucydides trap conflict with China. Is that what you're saying? No, because that makes no sense to me, right? It's almost like saying all Canadians are massive fans of Justin Bieber. It's a gross and I would say somewhat offensive generalization. So as a methodological note, I often steer clear, where possible, from making general claims and essentializing assertions about the peoples of different countries, as large as America or as small as Kosovo, which by the way is not necessarily recognized by all, but Kosovo is at least viewed by Kosovans as a country. So on that note, that's just a precursor and preamble. With that said, though, to answer your question in its perhaps fullest, which is essentially to what extent is maybe the military defense establishment in the US and possibly the so-called military industrial complex, although it's more complex than that because there's the divides within that complex and the complex is not a united whole. Let's just take that as sort of the core default in that question just then. And my answer would be, I do think that there's a sizable chunk of people within that demographic who firmly believe that it is in America's interest to contain China's rise strategically. That's their belief and their conviction. And I respect the fact that they have such beliefs, although I must, unfortunately, to them, unfortunately, on behalf of my own integrity, disagree. I am of the view that we can have a world where both China and the US can cooperate and get along. And even though I'm increasingly pessimistic about that happening, as I said recently in a speech I delivered, I'm increasingly pessimistic because I don't see the voices who believe in that vision winning out on both sides of the Pacific. I nevertheless maintain that that could be what the world looks like. So going back to your question, from the point of view of Beijing, they would argue that America is waging, as it stands, the American establishment at least, across both Democrats and Republicans, is waging a new Cold War of containment against China. Whereas many folks in America would defend this by saying, no, this is not a new Cold War. This is a defensive posture that is necessary in maintaining American presence and influence in a region where it has long-standing military and strategic interests. CF the three different island chains, CF its allies and partners with whom it shares treaties and strategic and comprehensive strategic partnerships. So that's a sort of disparity and divergence in perceptions, right? But in all honesty, if I were to comment on both sides' perceptions on a matter, I would say to the Chinese that not everything is a manifestation of bellicose containment, but there are elements of that, sure, in how the American establishment, especially the more hawkish, bellicose, and irrational elements within that, how they are reacting to China. There's certainly this temptation and this desire to chronically contain and suppress the rise of any strategic rival to America, whether it be Japan, China, or the USSR, so on and so forth. And yet, on the other hand, I would also say to the Americans that in lieu of seeing China as this sort of monolithically ever expanding, highly ambitious, highly aggressive and imperialist construct, okay, and almost a default aggressor, I don't think that's the right way of reading China. I think China is in many ways reacting to what it sees as external threats to security, and more specifically, the incumbent administration under the current party, the current ruling party of China, the only ruling party of China. They see attempts by America to set up these treaties, these alliances, these partnerships as demonstrative of American intentions to sabotage, right, what they take to be regime security. And it's imperative that even if you don't agree, right, as a diplomat or as a politician, even if you don't agree with this view, even if you say, I'm American, I'm going to see things my way, and you're Chinese, you're going to see things your way, so on and so forth, that at the very least you understand where the other side is coming from. And it is my concern that right now there's a tendency to over-exaggerate risks and threats from both sides, and an inability to appreciate legitimate grievances and concerns from both sides that are leading us down and have led us down this dangerous downward spiral. But thankfully, the meeting between President Xi and President Joe Biden, being seasoned statesmen and also politicians, the both of them, last year, did manage to put a floor, okay, and I guess a degree of stabilization for now to the bilateral relationship. But we're not this relationship or this temporary de-thawing of relations, which I do not see as a particularly permanent, no less because of Donald Trump's possible return in the States. We're not this relationship is likely to stay the way, okay? It is. And also, basically be capped off in terms of the floor that has been tenuously and tentatively set. I'm not so hopeful. So in short, I can appreciate the sentiments from both sides of the Pacific. I'm quite concerned. But even at times of pessimism and cynicism, I've long maintained the view that we need to learn to get along, because China and the US are both fantastic peoples, right? They are diverse, they are rich, they are incredibly rich, not just in wealth, but rich in terms of the civilizational history, their own spiritual thoughts, their own intellectual depth. I mean, America, for a modern country with only and no more than actually less than 3 decades of history, it's done incredibly well for itself. And the same could, of course, be said of China, right? Where some say China's inherited a multi-millennia civilization. I'm not going to go to that sort of classic trope of saying, oh, China is a 5,000-year-old country. I mean, that's what some people say. I wouldn't say that. But I would say that China also has immense historical legacy and tradition and heritage to share with the world. And both powers have to learn to get along, because how else can we deal with international crises such as peacekeeping, such as climate change, such as managing and containing pandemics, such as addressing public health challenges? So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm just going to say that once again, both powers need to start seeing the world through the other's lenses, as opposed to constantly emphasizing, this is my line, this is my world, and this is my vision. Because there's only one world. There's only one world, not just for these two powers, but for the remainder of the world's population, including India, which is the most populous nation in the world, Indonesia, the 4th most populous. These are very relevant stakeholders. The world is not just about China and the US, it's about all of us. And it's high time we started doing something about building in guardrails, minimizing possibility of kinetic conflict, and rekindling our desire and yearning for peace at a time when war and conflict seem also tempting. Thank you very much for having me, by the way. I'm going to dash off now because I've got a call to take. But thank you once again very, very much for having me, George.
Brian, thank you. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know that you're very busy. I want you to take that call. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Head on over to www.strategyinternational.org to get information on Strategy International. Brian, I think we should keep this conversation going because it was very interesting and very informative, I'm sure, for our viewers and listeners. I want to thank you so much for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.